Okay, so yeah, so thanks for the introduction there, and thanks also to Paul. It's an unusual environment presenting in this form because you don't get to see the faces of the audience, and when you present on a stage, you know, you can see whether you're losing the audience or not. But anyway, let's. I've already done one webinar, so I'm starting to get the feel of it. So this title, I'll kick it off with the title, and it adversity to advantage. It actually was referenced in a New York Times article recently, which was a title saying "Staying Nimble: How Small Business Can and Do Shift Gears," and it refers to a book by a Harvard professor, and her name, I can provide these references afterwards. I haven't actually read this book, but she says small businesses are really great at staying nimble. And I guess really what I want to say today is I don't think that that's actually, I agree with that statement. I think that they have the potential to be nimble. And I think that that's the major issue that, or the major thing I wanted to get across today is that the leaders, as leaders, we need to harness the advantages we have, but we have to consciously step into it. And I guess it's I learned this in my own journey, and I want to give you some insight into that journey so that you understand why I became so passionate about SMEs, and indeed having so much empathy for the founders and the entrepreneurs. So I think that I'm truly driven by empathy for the entrepreneur, because as I went on my journey, I didn't see that. I didn't see that there was enough business support for people that are founders and leaders of SMEs, as opposed to founders and leaders of corporations. And I found there to be, we are very, very different types of organizations and need totally different governance or stewardship or leadership models for how our organizations, how to run our organizations. So let's get into that a little bit more here. So Aquire was founded in 1996, and it was founded out of, I had been working in the mining industry for about, at that time, about 12 years. And I discovered an underserved need. There was a really burning underserved need. And it was that geoscientific information in the mining industry was stored in a very, very poor way. And what I did was discover that the, let me just put this down. There we go. Yeah, so what we discovered was that these observations and measurements that mining companies base all of their financial and safety decisions on were stored in Excel spreadsheets and stored in a very, very poor way. And so what we did was we made a discovery that there was a way that we could actually build relational database architecture where we could use third normal form, and we could store data in a way where we could solve the problem for all of the mining companies in the world and not have to build bespoke database solutions on a per company basis. So by doing this, we were able to store the data in quite an atomic form and then reconstitute it into different forms, which was a big positive for our customers. So, but in this founding period from '96 to around the year 2000, it was an extraordinarily difficult time. It's like all SMEs in their founding phases, it's really an easy journey. And in the year 2000, just to give you some idea of how difficult it was, that I went home to Debbie, my wife, and I said, look, we're going to have to extend the mortgage on our house to do payroll this month. And so we went really, really close to the wire there. And look, I'm a real believer that we all have luck and serendipity in business, and it's not all wonderment about the decisions we make. And so I had my own bit of luck there, but we actually also have to make decisions try and make good decisions with speed. And it was in this formative phase where I started to understand that. I started to understand, well, how do we make decisions, and how do we make good decisions, or at least give ourselves the best shot at making those decisions. So to give you some idea of where this company went, you know, I'll make the point that we weren't Google, you know, and I knew we were never going to be Google. I knew that, but we did become the #1 provider in the world in a niche. And it was a niche. It was a niche in a niche. but the point was that we ended up with quite a complex business. And as we went on this journey through this building this complex business, so we ended up with 7 offices in 6 countries. We had 28 nationalities. We had about 120 people at this time. We were deployed in 50 countries. And we had from 1996 to 2012, we had 16 years of revenue growth. And, you know, in that period of time, you know, we grew by, you know, about 50 times in revenue through that period. So, but the complexities that we had to deal with really made us begin to ask different questions. And so some of these complexities were things like, we had to deliver our services and our offering in 4 languages. We had to operate in approximately 7 currencies. We had to understand things like transfer pricing. And then we, you know, we were starting to ask questions about, you know, how do we actually recruit our people in a way that they're aligned regardless of where they are in the world. We said, well, why do people want to come and work for us, given it's a very competitive environment out there? We were hiring a lot of software engineers, mathematicians, but predominantly geoscientists. And geoscientists in a boom are a very, very rare commodity. You know, it's very hard to get good geoscientists. But so we had to try and work out, well, how do we make our place a place of choice that people want to come and work at, and answer those sorts of questions. We wanted, what was the vision for our offering? You know, we started asking questions about the motivations of people, and is money the only reason people come to work? And anyway, all of these questions about why, what, and how started to really push us in a totally different direction. And that direction was to say, and I'll talk more about this later, but the direction was to say, I am passionate about the craft of building our software and our offering in service of our customers. And I put all of my attention to that in the formative phase of the company. However, as the company grew, I started to realize I have to take my entrepreneurial brain and my, you know, any creativity I've got to actually design the organization to be able to deliver excellence, and to be able to do that, you know, in a sustained way. So all of that led to me becoming really, really fascinated by that. And for a lot of my, probably the last 5 years of my time in Aquire, it was 100% directed to building an R&D capacity within Aquire to actually answer a lot of these questions and to work out, how do you actually build resilience? How do I make sure that my business is going to survive, but not only survive without me, because I want it handed over for other people to run it. And so this is what led to the founding of Adapt by Design. So that's what I do now. I help founders and leaders build resilient businesses. And as I said before, it was a lot about this, driven by the SME problem and how do you lead an SME, and empathy for the entrepreneur. So let's crank on and let's get into it and say, okay, what is a resilient business? And I think that you're going to hear a lot about that, I think, over the course of the next 6 months to a year. But we're particularly interested in the idea around what is a resilient SME. And we define an SME as an organization where the ownership and the leadership have a big overlap. So, you know, an SME is generally, you usually find that there's between 1 and 3 leaders that were often the founder of the business, and often have those 1 to 3 people have the majority of the share capital of the business. And so to build, I have no clue and I have no knowledge at all about how to build a resilient corporation. That's not what I know anything about. And I'm going to explain why I think that an SME and a corporation are 2 totally different things. And that they need totally different governance systems and different models. And this is a very, very big point for me, because if we don't lean into that and understand that they're different, what I've noticed is that we tend to adopt ideas out of corporations that we think are best practice, that I think actually are not in service of an SME at all. I think that they can be, and examples of this are the actual concept of having a HR department idea. In an SME, the culture and the organization, the place that everybody wants to come to, that is run and owned by the leaders of the SME. And so to actually set up a HR function is not necessarily the best way to solve building a great aligned team. So I'll talk more about that later, but let me just talk about this boom and bust picture here. In 1996, we began building Aquire at the beginning of it was at the top of a boom. For the next 6 years, it went into a very horrible recession. Now, before the recession of 2016 to 2012 to 2017, and the downturn in mining and resources, the previous was 2002. So I don't know if people remember back that far, but if you do, the geoscientists, you know, you could get a geoscientist to do logging on a rig at about $185 a day. You know, now in the top of a boom, that would be $1,850 a day. So you can see that there is a big, big difference between booms and busts. So that was our first experience. We were actually launching our offering in the depths of a bust, right? Then we had a massive boom that went from 2002 to 2009. We were impacted by the GFC because a lot of companies couldn't get money to do their projects. And so we thought, oh, okay, you know, and that was a really big issue for us, but we learned a lot from it. And then we had the another boom between 2010 and 2012. And then we had quite a bad bust from 2012 to 2017. And as most people that are in mining will tell you, it's been on the up and up since then. So through these booms and busts, you can actually make the decision as a leader to follow the boom and bust line. Now that's a perfectly, if that's the way you want to go. But for an SME, I think that's an extraordinarily, I don't think that, we'll put it this way, that's not resilience. And the reason it's not resilience is because people are business. Great businesses are made up of great people that can be effective and productive. And so I didn't want to lose our software architect. I didn't want to lose our field geoscientists. I didn't want to lose all of this incredible knowledge that we were building. And if intellectual property was stored on your balance sheet, there's no way you'd follow a boom and bust line. Because if you follow the boom and bust line, you need to actually remunerate people in the boom, in ways that is just not sustainable for your business. And then when it comes to a bust, the only way to actually survive is to offload the people. So in this period, we actually came up, and it wasn't like it was a super conscious thing, oh, here's this line, but this is what evolved, is that we ended up building a company that followed a positive gradient design line so that we retained our people. They didn't leave us to go and work for others in the boom, and I'll explain why. And then we became a phenomenal employer in a bust because we weren't offloading people. Now this is at the cornerstone, I think. This is a cornerstone example of what a resilient business is, because it means that you can have an organizational memory, and it means that you can actually build your organization cumulatively. So what happens 5 years out, you're actually building on top of the knowledge and the learnings from 5 years before. Now, one of the great challenges is many corporations are really struggling with organizational memory. And this is one great benefit of being a smaller organization, is that I think we can build cultures, retain great people for long periods of time. Now to this, I've got to give you a story. I'm going to throw to some questions after this slide. I see we're at 11:33, but I think I'm on track. The story is that Steve Mundell, he's a leader at Aquire. Steve, I did ask if Steve minded me relaying the story. It's just that when you bring it into, this story is about a wonderful guy. He's still a leader at Aquire. He was, in 2005, was going to take a job somewhere else. And I sat down with him, and I was really, really down about it because he was currently a geoscientist that implemented our software technology. And I had this belief that I thought he could end up being a leader of the product. And so anyway, I thought he was going to leave us. And then I got on the whiteboard and I actually said, okay, Steve, tell me about the job you're going to. And he said it was mine geo job. And I thought, wow, a mine geo job, that's crazy, because he's a real athlete. Like, he was a, really environmental athlete sort of guy. And I knew that he wouldn't be able to do his training. So anyway, without going into this story in great detail, I ended up finding out that his motivation, he'd never really done an analysis of his own motivations in making the analysis of what job he should do. So from that point, we invented something called the career evaluation tool to help people understand their own motivations so that they could use that tool to help them make decisions about what's the best job for them at that particular instant of their life. And it was just an extraordinary learning, because it was where we started to pivot away from the whole idea that people are motivated by money. Now, here's a reference. Dan Pink's book, Drive, talks a lot about this. And he says that people are predominantly motivated. Intrinsic motivation revolves around three primary things. People want to work in a business with purpose, right? But there's two primary things that they want. One is that they are driven by autonomy and mastery. And autonomy is being able to work in a place where you're given license to they don't want to be working in power hierarchies where there's a coercive force. So the old ideas of people, you know, sort of saying, okay, I'm going to either give you a carrot or a stick. Here's a monetary incentive, or I'm going to deny your right to work here. These aren't great ways to build business. And with an SME, because we're dealing with smaller scale, we've got the opportunity, we've got tight decision rights and small scale, we've got the opportunity to actually build businesses that people want to come and work in, right? Because we can actually deliver on that autonomy, we can deliver on mastery, and mastery is craftsmanship. And craftsmanship is, I think we all in SMEs, we get fascinated by the problem and building the craftsmanship to actually solve the problem. So autonomy, mastery, and purpose. We can deliver on that in SME, and because we've got the decision rights to do so. And so so there's four characteristics that I think an SME can harness that I think are really what define an SME. First of all, you can maximize stakeholder outcomes, which means that you can build your business in service of customers. You can build your business in service of the people in your business. And then you can, you've got tight and simple decision rights, because the leadership and the ownership, there is a big overlap. You've got small scale, and this then presents the opportunity for a long-term strategic horizon. You can actually start to build your business knowing that there's going to be booms and busts in the future, and that's where you can start to say, okay, if there's going to be booms and the busts in the future, how can I actually start to craft my business to be able to deal with those booms and busts? So what I'm going to do there is I'm going to pause it and just get some questions from everybody, and you know, I think if we could maybe get 2 questions, that would be great. So I'll let Roma actually facilitate this bit.
Thank you, Bill. Yes, I haven't seen any questions in the chat yet, but I think that's because, like me, everyone was listening to the stories and what Bill had to say. So if anyone has a question at this stage, can you put your hand up? Does everyone know how to do that? Well, I have one to get started, and I guess it's, Bill, I can see that, you know, you've put a lot of thought and everything into the creating, the designing the business, but one question I have is, like, where do you find the time to do that when you're busy with a startup or a small business and work is just seemingly all consuming? How do you dedicate a time each week, or how do you manage that side of it?
Yeah, well, I think this is a really good question, and I hope to, before my time's out here today, to drill into this a bit. So we all know that business, there's just so much to do, and it's in the doing of business that often we get consumed by it, and so we tend to be reacting to the daily demand, if you like. And I think it was just a process that I went through to start to realize that a lot of the work I was doing, a lot of I was reacting to, was because I didn't put a little bit of plumbing in my business. So I began to change my own behaviors about where I decided to put time and how I decided to prioritize work. So I call this personal stewardship. So I'll share sometimes my metaphors, people go, really? Anyway, I'll have a crack. I'm going to use balls, right? So imagine business is about work. It's getting work done. And let's say that we have 4 levels of balls. We have golf balls, tennis balls, basketballs, and beach balls. Now, let's just imagine that people know the dimension of those. So a beach ball is bigger than a basketball, which is bigger than a tennis ball, which is bigger than a golf ball. A golf ball is a task like, I get a phone call from Debbie and she says, can you pick up some potatoes on your way home tonight? That's a golf ball, right? We're thinking about opening an office in the Ukraine, right? That's a beach ball. So the problem is that I think a lot of people, you need to get very disciplined if you're going to do good work on beach balls and basketballs. And I think that a lot of people get in the habit of trying to manage their work by doing golf balls and tennis balls. So the systems that they might use for golf balls and tennis balls, email, right? Or maybe even a little task system. But there you go. So it's how do you steward yourself to say, okay, I want to do some basketballs and beach balls. How do I then give myself time, and how do I build a system to manage them that's different to the little guys? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good answer. Thank you, Bill. We've also got a question from Sergio Zachariah. Sergio's asked if you had a mentor or a trusted advisor to guide and help you, and do you see value in that?
I definitely do. I definitely do. And I think that the mentors for me a lot of them were inside the business. I was very fortunate there, like to have colleagues, good colleagues. So I'll give you an example. I made the decision pretty early on to hire a chartered accountant. We were only 20 people, and I hired a very, very experienced chartered accountant into the business. Now, that person had a big impact on being a sort of consigliere because he had a strategic mind and had a skill set that I didn't have. But also I was well connected into all sorts of different groups externally to be able to have conversations with other founders. And I found that the most valuable, having conversations with other founders and other people that were in the same situation as me. So, for instance, things like Tech Group and those sorts of things are really good groups to get, ideas and mentorship from people with a similar challenge.
Thank you, Bill. I think that's enough for questions for now. We best press on.
No problem. Okay.
Thank you. Thanks for your question, Serge.
Thank you. Okay, so let's keep going here. So this picture, I think, is also I'm going to talk to it for a bit because I'm going to go into a section which is about, the barriers to building a resilient business. And I genuinely believe, and I think that Roma's question's a great segue to this, is that a lot of the barriers are about the habits that leaders build and then the habits that have become the habits of the organization. And if you say, I'm going to get a different outcome by having the same habits, well, it just won't happen. You have to make some decisions to change both personal habits and organizational habits. And so I want to just tell you a bit about my journey. For a long time, I didn't even know I was leading a company. I was just driven by the craft, and we were just getting stuff done to actually build a good piece of technology and to be able to deploy it and to make sure that our customers were happy with the offering. And that's what we did. Between my predominant role was, I don't know if anybody's heard of the book, The E-Myth. It was a book, or The E-Myth Revisited. It was a book I read in the 90s by Michael Gerber. And he referenced being in your business and being on your business. And I think that it's a really good way of being able to understand the challenge of doing reactionary work to doing proactive work. And so between 96 and 2008, I would say I had a bias toward reactive and not doing too much on work. I did as much as I could, but this is where I started to change my habits and my behavior. And that's where it has to begin. It's with the leader's behavior. And so I started, and it was 2004 was a really pivotal year, because it was when I started to really understand the difference between being in as an executor in these doing roles in the business, in as a function leader where I'm a team leader of people, and on as a leader of the organization. And so if you look at my journey, I went from this period where I was very much in with a little bit of on, to this period where I was starting to get a better balance between on and in. And then this period, and you'll see that they all overlap because it's not as clean as that. But you'll see that in 2009, I no longer had any in function, and I was 100% on my business. And so I think that this is the great benefit of doing this, is that it also creates the conditions for succession. And succession thinking is one of the most fundamental things for building resilience. So let me tell you a story about key person risk. People used to say, oh, have you got key man insurance? And we'd go, oh, no, okay, we'd go get it. And we were spending an exorbitant amount of money on, and this is when we were small, this is when we were less than 20, on key person insurance. And then we said, well, what's this money for? I mean, the money, what's it going to do? Well, it's going to pay for a salary for somebody to come into the business. But if one of us goes down, what about the intellectual property we hold? Too much of our knowledge is tacit. So it's when I started to realize, well, it's not key man insurance we need. We need a way to be able to hand over the knowledge of the business and distribute the knowledge of the business so that we didn't have fragility in any specific person getting ill or whatever else. And so this is another big part of building an anti-fragile organization, is that you don't want to have, the typical sorts of problems there are one person is the holder of the secret source of the intellectual property of the business. Well, that's really dangerous, right? And so that's where I realized that if I became a role-centric person, not bill-centric person, so I don't design around people, I design around the roles that people do, then I could actually build internal mobility. Internal mobility is hugely valuable, because then you've got a greater capacity for multi-skilling and not getting to that situation where you've got a lot of knowledge tied up in one or two people. So it was sort of like the two things, the boom bust thinking and this succession thinking. When you slam them together, they really, really inform what a resilient business is. And so my own journey was, I was in the business well and truly up until 2008. And then I became very much on my business from 2009 to 2018. But I also had a period, and I think this is worth mentioning, that I had a period where I'd even handed over all the on work to others. And so I was able, through this process, to get 100% of my time back. So in 2014, I founded Adapt by Design. So I still owned 47% of Aquire in 2014, but I was 100% in another business. And I think that that's another example, because then that business can continue to run without you. Whereas in this phase here, I was central to just about every function of the business. So just doing a time check there. It's 11:52. I think we're moving through this pretty well, but I'll just underscore this. The summary of this is to say, move from doing to really starting to lean in. Well, how do we do things? So how questions like, well, how do we recruit people? You know, how do we define roles? How do we create a business that's got a role-centric approach that gives us this succession of knowledge capability? Anyway, so let's move on. So let me tell a story about behavior, and this is really a critical story, and this is later in my leadership journey. But it's about, I went away on a excursion with a bunch of leaders, and we were doing a workshop, and the facilitator stopped it and said, "Does Bill usually do that?" And everybody in the room ultimately said yes. And so what the facilitator did was they said, "Bill, would you mind going through a fishbowl?" And I said, "Well, what's a fishbowl?" Every one of these people is going to tell you what's wrong with you, right? I mean, what are the behaviors that are actually not serving the system, not serving the organization? I said, okay then. I said, and I can still remember being like, a school kid dragging his school bag home at the end of that day, because I heard just what behaviors I had that everyone detested or didn't like or got in the way of me being as good a leader as I could be. And my problem was that when I get passionate, I can just vomit on people. Not actually vomit on people, but somebody called it, talking to Bill's like drinking from a fire hydrant. You know, like I wouldn't give them the airtime, right? It's still a problem today. I didn't give them the airtime. And what that was I was becoming a knower. And there's a model called the knower learner. And so I actually had to build a new behavior to actually deal with my knowerism. And it was to say, right, how do I flick out of knowerism and become a learner again? And it's difficult, it's challenging, but if I didn't do that, I honestly don't think I would have been able to do certainly the last phases of Aquire. But more importantly, what I really wished is that I learnt that lesson earlier, right? And that's why I think that the earlier we can start to lean into behavior and founders' behavior and leadership behavior as being so critical to great outcomes for your business. So there's another model called the player victim model. And most entrepreneurs, most of the times, can be players. They say, they use I will. They own stuff, right? But sometimes they fall into they should. And when you say they should, they're words that come up. You know, the government should, or the company should, right? So that starts to get into that victim mindset where you're not owning your own stuff. All you can control is your own behavior and your own decision making. So these are really vital parts to the barriers to building an organization, because it's the behavior of the people with the greatest decision rights that has the biggest impact on your business, right? And so if you want to build a great business, you need to make it psychologically safe for everybody else, right? And to make it psychologically safe and then make it an effective organization, you need to have clarity of guidance. You know, what is your alignment of purpose and values? How do you do effective stewardship, which is basically how do you make good decisions? You know, how do you deal with the beach balls and the basketballs as well as the tennis balls and golf balls? Get clarity about who does what when, you know, like role clarity. Make sure that people are accountable, not through fear, because we want trust and psychological safety, but people own their own work and they do the work, right? And then have meaningful progress for everybody so that they can feel that they're moving and that they're achieving. So I'm going to, so good, a leader that is building a resilient business will build focus, discipline, and accountability, right? Focus, discipline, and accountability, right? I mean, I'm as bad as anyone, you know, like I'm an entrepreneur. I love creating things, and I can get distracted to the next shiny thing, but it's dangerous if you do that unconsciously. Maybe I could just do a wrap up, because I can just say, well, so to bring this back down to ground, what we're going to do is try and just run sessions, the subsequent sessions, in ways where we break it down into smaller questions to help people solve specific problems. So perhaps if I just go to, you know, the next slide. I've already spoken quite a bit about prioritization and how you make decisions and what work you decide to prioritize. So I think that's I've already covered that point, but I think if you think that you're going to actually be able to build a resilient business by not changing organizational habits or your own habits, I think it's going to be, unless your business is already in a resilient state, it's going to be difficult. So that's the part I wanted to just make the point, that you're going to have to prioritize work differently just to give yourself a little bit of on time to be able to make the journey. So that's that point. But I just wanted to say that the next session, we're going to break it down into each session, 4 subsequent sessions. We're going to go into detail in culture and break up these 3 questions and say, okay, well, how do we do this? And I want to do it in a way where your organization might be less than 10 or less than 5, you know, or less than 20, but try and give you something tangible around these questions.